Why hello there, and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. And in this episode, I'm going to be looking at Moonlight on Roseville Beach, a queer game of disco and cosmic horror, which was released in 2022 by R Rook Studio, and is really the sort of thing that does a pretty good job of introducing itself, so I guess on to the review. Moonlight on Roseville Beach is set in the year 1979 in the small town of, well, Roseville Beach, on the barrier island of Rose off the US coast. And because of that, it is a very small setting, but one that is detailed fairly well. There are 12 key locations, places like nightclubs, hotels, and the occult bookstore, which are given fairly brief write-ups in the front of the book, but then are explained in greater detail in the Game Master section. And that is something that I generally do like to see. Give the players just the information they need to play their characters, and then give all the additional information to the Game Master later in the book. Because yes, there's a lot of stuff that the players shouldn't know, but there's also a lot that they just don't need to know. And notably, this is also what the book refers to as a queer norm setting, meaning that the populations of Roseville Beach and the nearby town of Pinewood are predominantly LGBT et al. And it is specifically mentioned that the level of inclusivity in terms of orientation, gender identity, race, etc. is by modern standards, not by 1979 standards. However, then beyond this small community is still 1979 America. So there are some really strong themes of community to this game, but also finding community. There is quite a bit of focus on characters coming to Roseville Beach, representing it as a place that one goes to in search of acceptance that cannot be found elsewhere. And that theme of an accepting but isolated community is one that actually shapes a lot of the game. It provides a setting where queer characters can just kind of exist in 1979 without pretending that bigotry wasn't a thing, or having it be something that you just have to constantly deal with. But it also makes getting help from outside the community very unlikely. It comes up multiple times in the book that the best case scenario from calling the police is being ignored, meaning that the community has to watch out for itself. So if there's, say, some kind of mystery, it would be up to a group of ragtag amateur sleuths to solve it. That would be the player characters. The setting is also one that limits the scope of the game. Roseville Beach is a small town on a small island. It doesn't even have cars, so unless you're taking the ferry to the mainland, which the book says is a thing you're not likely to need to do, pretty much the entire setting is within walking distance, which also means that your entire investigation is going to be within walking distance. So a +1 for setting. It is a setting that not only reinforces the themes of the game, but also seems to have been designed with being a setting for a game in mind. Which is probably the top thing that tabletop role-playing games can actually learn from video games. Players in Moonlight on Roseville Beach take on the role of a group of housemates living together in a bungalow, and also solving mysteries. Because, that's what you do in the cosmic horror game. You investigate mysteries, hopefully solve them, and don't get killed. So I guess, let's make us a mystery friend. First, we must select an origin story for our character, the options being the fresh face, a young adult striking out on their own for the first time; scandalous, someone who was the subject of a well-known scandal; shifter, someone who can transform into some kind of animal; the witch, that one's pretty self-explanatory; the familiar, yes, like an animal familiar, which puts this game in the prestigious category of games where you can play as a cat; and the stranger, who is someone from beneath the sea, across the void, that means space, or another dimension. So something of a mix of options here. And let's go with witch. Our witch is 46 plus 16 years old, or we can choose any legal age, I just like rolling. And as a witch, we of course have witchcraft, which grants us the witch background and the sorcery skill. Then we must choose a background from magic shop, liberal arts degree, and veterinary tech. And let's go with magic shop. Then we roll 2 skills on the magic shop skill list. Alchemy and administration. That sounds like either the worst D&D knockoff ever, or the best. Next up, we roll 3 words of power, and we got summon, water, and propel. Next, we have troubles, which are people that we owe, are hiding from, are trying to impress, or are counting on us. So we roll on the troubles table, and someone in Roseville Beach helped you get set up with a place, a job, and some money when you got here. Add their name under People I Owe on your character sheet. And we are still kind of figuring out this character, so let's just leave that as someone for now. Then we choose a job, and from the options available, let's go with assistant at the care center. That seems like something where our administrative abilities could be of use. And maybe the alchemy too. Then we roll 1 skill from our job, and running. That is probably going to be useful. But then, things get strange. We choose one strange event that we have witnessed, and let's go with the lights in the harbor. And then we discuss the details of that event with the player sitting to our left, who was also there. And there is no player sitting to our left because this is just an example, so let's just say that we and the imaginary other player saw the mysterious lights in the harbor, but Thomas Ashford, who works at the tacky souvenir shop near the harbor, was also there and he claims to have seen nothing. Then we roll to see what effect this has on our character, and start the game with a new trouble. Someone is clearly watching you. Write the silent observer under People I'm Hiding From on your character sheet. Then we get 1 ally, and let's say an older witch who lives near the swamp and seems to know a lot about the mystical goings-on Rose Island. And then we choose 3 comforts, which are special places, things, or people that are comforting. So let's go with a secluded bluff overlooking a particularly turbulent patch of ocean, a childhood spell book, and a cheap gaudy necklace that was a gift from our first girlfriend. Then let's pull this all together and say that our character, Sarah Bishop, was involved in the Los Angeles occult scene where she learned witchcraft while working in a magic shop under the tutelage of the owner, who she was also dating because she does not make good decisions. But then after a very messy breakup and expressing a desire to get as far away as possible, one of her exes got her in contact with one of her exes living in Roseville Beach, who helped get her set up. So that is the person she owes. Let's just say Aubrey Banks. That's a pulpy sounding name. Then she moved in with the other housemates, made friends with a mysterious hedge witch, had some spooky adventures including seeing some lights in the harbor, and this character is done. So overall, pretty simple. You pick a thing, roll a few things, pick a few other things, and you're done. But I do like a lot of what's going on here. Like how the origin stories provide both tawdry romance pulp tropes as well as science fiction and horror pulp tropes. This game has 2 very distinctive influences, and I like that they give you the option to build your character based around whichever one of those 2 you would most like to play. Also notably, aside from the fresh face, all of the origin stories are some kind of outsider. Someone who's been disgraced by a scandal, a shapeshifter, a witch, a familiar who has lost their sorcerer, a visitor from another world. All sorts of people who, even in this accepting setting, are still going to have some level of barrier between being fully accepted by those around them. Which I'm sure isn't like an allegory or anything. I also really like the focus on connections, not just to the other players, but to NPCs, literally requiring that characters have multiple defined connections to other people in the game world. Because let's be honest here, a lot of games suffer from something of a mysterious stranger syndrome, where the player characters are very disconnected from the world around them, with NPCs only really serving as sources of items and directions to the next plot point. But this is a game where character relationships have a meaningful impact, not just as a resource, but also, as the game calls them, troubles. Like yes, you have allies who can assist you when you need them, but also you can have a jealous ex who shows up while you're investigating the mysterious disappearances in the swamps and just makes everything more complicated. And another detail I really like is the strange event. Not just in the way that it gives you a history with one of the other characters, but also that it places you in a position where you've already seen some weird stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean you're desensitized to it, just that you don't have to deal with the whole, oh my god, I'm seeing something that shakes the very foundations of my perception of reality thing in every single game. You can just get on with the mystery. So a 4 out of 6 for character creation. It is somewhat basic in terms of, I guess, indie game standards, but I really like how they kept it very thematically appropriate and also went through the trouble of focusing on all those character connections, essentially forcing you to create a character who, at least on paper, is an entity who has existed in the game world prior to the first session. Overall, this is a fairly mechanics-light game. In general, you only really need to roll when there is moderate risk in what you're doing. But then when you do roll, things get kinda interesting. So let's say our character is rowing back from Odd Island. Her investigation took longer than expected and now it's pitch black out. Only the stars and the distant lights of Roseville Beach in the distance penetrating the inky darkness. When suddenly, something begins violently slamming against her rickety rowboat, which is now taking on water at an alarming pace. So obviously, the most dramatically appropriate thing to do here is jump into the water and swim for shore, which involves a lot of risk and therefore requires a roll. We have a pool of dice that starts at 1, and dice are added for things like relevant backgrounds and skills or the assistance of allies. But the only relevant thing right now is not being injured or scared in a way that inhibits what we're doing. Then we roll on the goal table, but the GM says that we must also roll on the injured and scared tables, because those are both possible consequences of this risky action. So we roll our dice, getting a 4 and 5, which would be a good roll if not for the fact that we have 2 dice, which we need to assign to 3 tables. So let's assign the 5 to goal and the 4 to injury, and since we do not have any more dice, any additional tables are treated as 1s. Which means that we make progress on our goal and avoid injury, but not a scare. So she jumps from the boat and takes off swimming, all the while feeling the creature moving through the dark waters around her. But when she's almost reached the shore, something wraps around her leg and pulls her beneath the surface. So we take a scare, let's just say pretty sure we're about to die, and also a thing I will explain later. But right now we are in a fairly dire situation and a good time to remember that we have magic. So let's say that we want to magically water jet our way out of this situation. Magic functions basically the same as any other roll, except that the things that add dice to the pool are different. So we notably do not get a die for not being scared in a way that inhibits our magic. It is pretty safe to say we are freaking out right now. But we do get dice for our Witch Origin, Sorcery Skill, and Water and Propel Words of Power. Then we have the same goal, injured, and scared tables, but also a special magic control table, because we need to control the magic. So we roll our dice, and this time we have more dice than tables, and I assume that in that situation we can add multiple dice to specific tables, as the goal table succeeds on a 6+, and that is the only way your result can be higher than 6. So obviously we want to succeed and not lose control of our magic, but that does mean we're going to have to pay a price for it. So she forms the arcane sigils with her fingers and chokes out the incantation, water threatening to fill her lungs each time she opens her mouth. Then with a flash of eldritch light, she's ripped from her captor's grasp and flung to the shore by a powerful jet of seawater, crashing hard on the sand. So we have eluded the creature and made it to shore, but also taken an injury and a scare. Let's say dislocated shoulder and terrified of the stretch of ocean between Rose and Odd Islands. And that is the bulk of the mechanics, and as I said, it is kinda interesting. Letting the players assign the roles like that adds an extra little bit of strategy to the game. Do you succeed at the cost of injury, or do you only take a partial success without? It gives players a little more control of the situation, but in a way that still maintains a certain level of unpredictability. You do also have the option of adding an extra die to your roll at the cost of adding an extra table, the Troubles table, which can invoke one of you or your housemates' troubles. So earlier, when I mentioned the possibility of a jealous ex showing up and getting in the way of your investigation, that was because there are literally mechanics for that thing happening in the game. As I keep saying, it's a game that really likes to focus on all of the messy connections that people have, and having to deal with them while also cosmic horror. The injuries and scares are also pretty interesting. It is pretty much just a simplified health and sanity system, and basically you can take 3 injuries or 3 scares, at which point you are no longer either physically or mentally able to continue going until such time as you no longer have 3 of either. And what does it take to remove an injury or a scare, I hear you asking? Well, that is complicated. As shown in the example, each injury or scare is specifically defined. We ended that scene scared we were going to die, afraid of the ocean, and with a dislocated shoulder. And then those things get better when they would reasonably get better. So the scared we are about to die is something that reasonably would only last until removed from the situation where we think we are about to die, and given some time, perhaps with one of our comforts, to just kind of calm down and take in the whole situation. But fear of the ocean, and specifically that thing in the ocean that tried to kill us, that is the sort of thing that's not really going to go away until we solve the mystery of that thing in the ocean. And they can also be downgraded. Like, a dislocated shoulder is kind of a serious problem, but once we get that popped back in, we're still going to have a sore shoulder. It is still an injury, just a less severe injury. And you may have noticed that the language very specifically states injured or scared in a way that inhibits what you're doing. So while we're still freaking out about almost getting drowned and or eaten with a dislocated shoulder, those 2 things are probably going to affect almost anything we try to do. But after a trip to the care center and half a pack of cigarettes, our remaining fear of the ocean and sore shoulder probably aren't going to inhibit that many things, as long as we stay away from the ocean. So it is very much a system that requires the GM to enforce the rules fairly and competently. They need to assign an appropriate scare or injury for each specific situation, but then also need to determine when it is appropriate for those things to inhibit your actions, and then also when and how those things get better. Like, a sore shoulder is really only going to affect things involving strenuous use of the shoulder. A fear of the ocean is only going to affect things in or around the ocean. Neither of those 2 are going to affect our ability to run away from a swarm of elder bees that have been summoned by an angry cultist. It is one of those things where the rule is use common sense, which unfortunately is a thing that the book cannot provide for you. The equipment system is also pretty neat and kind of abstract. I know, shocker, I think an abstract equipment system is neat. That's never happened before. Basically, your character has all of the stuff that they would reasonably have for whatever they're doing. If you're hanging out at the beach, you probably have a towel. If you're on a dinner date, you probably don't. But then also you can have brought up to 3 small simple items when you need them. So if you are walking home from your dinner date and you notice a cave that you're almost positive wasn't there yesterday, you can very conveniently have thought to bring a flashlight. But then if you need anything more significant than that, you have to go back to the bungalow, which has a supply rating that you can roll against to determine if it has the supplies that you need. But then the more you use that resource, the supply rating will go down, and when it gets to 0, you can no longer get supplies from the bungalow. And as I've said, I really like these abstract equipment systems. At no point do you have to make a detailed list of every single thing on your person or in the bungalow, but you still have a system where your access to items is limited and can be exhausted, without having stupid situations like having your entire adventure grind to a halt because you just forgot to bring chalk or matches. And then one last thing I should probably mention is there is also an optional quick roll system, which is more of a traditional roll, check a chart, and then succeed, fail, or mixed results. For those times when you just need a quick, simple result, like a basic spot check or casting a simple spell. Things that either don't fit or don't need the full extent of the core mechanic. So a 4 out of 6 for mechanics. The core mechanic is different and interesting, and that is a thing I like. And it also adds a nice gameplay element, having you assign the results and have to make those decisions. It is, however, an involved mechanic, and one that you want to use sparingly so as not to be too obtrusive to the actual flow of the game. And from there, it does also rely a lot on Game Master judgment, which is also a thing that I usually like, because that's the whole point of having a conscious human being running the game. They can use judgment and make decisions on things that are not expressly outlined for them. I so rarely have anything interesting to talk about in the content section, and this time I actually do. So the book has the regular stuff, setting information, character creation, basic mechanics, then a Game Master section with some general advice, additional rules, random tables for things like NPC reactions, and then, as mentioned earlier, more in-depth looks into some of the locations and personalities of the setting, as well as 5 pre-written mysteries. And all of that stuff is good. My only real comment is that some of the advice is a bit obvious, but then again, if you need to be told that you should know the solution to the mystery before you start the game, I guess it's good that the book tells you that. But the really interesting thing is the guest stars, which you might think are like pre-generated characters, and kinda, but not exactly. They are characters intended for drop-in players. So when someone asks if they can join in on your game on short notice, yes, they can. However, I did say they are not exactly pre-generated characters, and that is because they are not generated with the character creation system. They do not have the same origin stories, backgrounds, etc. that player characters do. They are all unique characters with their own backgrounds, their own skills, in many cases special items and abilities. They even have their own supply rating. My personal favorite being the Awakened Statue, who is a Greek warrior who was turned to stone by Medusa and then awakened in the modern era, and has the ability to talk to statues and characters in paintings, and is in Roseville Beach looking for another person who was turned into a statue. And that's another thing, they each have a little story, usually one that gives them a reason for being there. So if you are playing one of these characters, you already have something to tie you to the setting and something to go off of when you start the game. But also, you can very easily use those as hooks for making a little one-shot around one of these characters. It is a very unique resource to have, a thing specifically intended to more easily allow players to join a few sessions of an ongoing campaign without having to make characters and then have those characters integrated into the story. Because remember, a big part of character creation and the game is character connections. But these are very much independent characters, designed both mechanically and narratively to be easily dropped in and out of a campaign. They have their own story, their own goals, their own stuff. They can get mixed up in your adventure, or you can get mixed up in theirs, and then they can just leave, and it's not really going to affect the overall campaign. So a +1 for content. Overall, most of the stuff is fairly average, but I really like getting multiple adventures in the core book, and then also, as I said, I really like those guest characters. It is the sort of thing that I've never really seen before done quite like that. The book is overall written well and a fairly enjoyable read. It does take something of a more lighthearted approach to the subject matter, but also doesn't shy away from being more serious. Like occasionally reminding you why calling the police is not an option, and just in general providing a bit of that unpleasant but very relevant historical context. There is also a bit of space devoted to safety and inclusivity, and then also they've done things to that end, such as including pronouns whenever a new character is introduced in the text. Which is the kind of thing that would be nice to see just more in general role-playing games, because I don't know about you, but if you introduce me to Telfmar, the graceful elven warrior, that does not tell me if they are a he, she, or they. Or fae. I guess fae might be appropriate since they're an elf. There are also a number of short flash fictions throughout the book, which are just kind of there to set the tone and give you little snippets of story for what goes on in Roseville Beach. And one of the more notable aspects of the writing here, this book has a lot of contributing writers, like 20. However, despite that, the overall writing style does feel very consistent. And this book has a very distinctive style. Overall, the layout is very nice, with a bit of variety in the text formatting, switching between 1 and 2 column layouts, but in a way that still feels cohesive. And then of course, all of the vintage pulp art does an amazing job of conveying the pulpy mood of the game. And there are some other fun little details like fake ads, and one detail that I absolutely love, a fake order form in the back, because if there is one thing that says cheap paperback, it is that. However, I do have one small complaint. I don't want to have a complaint because the thing is absolutely gorgeous, but the text does very much say 1979, and all of this art very much says late 50s, early 60s. Of course, maybe that is because in 1979, if you were to go to the used bookstore and pick up some cheap paperbacks, they would be from the late 50s and early 60s. I mean, most of the cheap paperbacks I read are from the 80s or earlier. So no adjustment for writing. It does a good job explaining the game while also conveying the themes and making sure to do so in an inclusive way. And 6 out of 6 for presentation. This book looks amazing. It takes an aesthetic and absolutely runs with it, but never does so at the cost of readability. And that was Moonlight on Roseville Beach. One of those things that has a very distinctive concept, combining two things that don't seem like they'd really work that well together, but they kinda do, and then actually delivers on the promises of that interesting concept. It retains a lot of the campiness of tawdry queer pulp novels while removing the more negative elements. There can still be lots of drama and scandals, just going to be based around the characters' tawdry affairs and machinations rather than their orientation. And then all of that while also solving mysteries that threaten your small island community. It is, however, a game where a big factor in your experience is going to be the quality of your game master. Both in knowing how and when to implement the mechanics, but also maintaining an appropriate tone when dealing with potentially sensitive topics. It is a game that makes no attempt to absolve the game master of the responsibility of making decisions. As shown earlier, you can just choose to give a character a condition that lasts for a few hours, or the entire adventure. There is no rule telling you when you can and cannot inflict a wound of a specific severity, beyond common sense, and don't be a dick. So overall, a really good game, provided you have the right group for it. The themes and mechanics do seem like they require a certain level of maturity from both players and game master for everything to run smoothly. So that is it for Moonlight on Roseville Beach, and thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Randy Mulholland, and Toshiro Kuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that either myself or the cold heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.